Welcome, students. We're going to take some notes on the two-party system. This is going to be a timeline set of notes instead of a traditional set of notes. So you'll need to draw a line down the middle of your piece of paper and title this the two parties timeline. This is just simply going to be a broad history of the two-party system, nothing super detailed. But what we'll mainly focus on is where the two parties come from, and really to understand the Republicans versus the Democrats. The Republican elephant focuses more on the past, that the past is best, that the past guides the way. And so they desire to conserve, and that's why they're called conservatives. Conserve the past, conserve the ideas, that the founding fathers knew it best. The Democrats, on the other hand, they want to look to the future. They are the progressives, so to speak, or liberals, and they want to progress society, and that's why they seek to look to the future and new ways of doing things, and they want to progress things. At any rate, when you look at who you are, we've been looking at how you're a social being, a political being, an economic being. Well, in order to know your political, you need to know your social and your economic, and so we'll be looking at those things. For the elephants, the right, known as the conservatives, they want to conserve the past. They believe in freedom in the economy, but government control in personal matters. They are typically supported by businessmen, and so they want freedom in the economy so that there's not any big laws or red tape in the economy, but they want a lot of freedom in the economy, less taxes. Whereas in government control of personal matters, because of traditional values, again, they want to conserve the past, conserve those traditional values, such as traditional marriage and prohibitions against illicit drugs. And so they want to government control of that. When it comes to the Democrats, on the other hand, the donkeys on the left, the liberals, as they call themselves, they're typically supported by low-income people and working class unions. They want freedom in personal matters, diverse lifestyles, but government control of the economy because they don't trust rich people, kind of like Robin Hood, steal from the rich and give to the poor, kind of a redistribution of wealth. And we see this mantra today. And so are the Republicans more into freedom? Are the Democrats more into freedom? It depends on, are you talking about economic or social? Again, remember that your political is defined by your view of the economy and your view of society. So if you want freedom in both economy and society, you'd be more of a libertarian, not a liberal Democrat donkey. If you want more freedom in the economy but less freedom in society, then you're more of a Republican elephant, conservative. For the donkeys, the liberals, if you want government control of the economy but more freedom in society, then that's who you would be. Now, looking historically, you don't need to write this down, but the Three-Fifths Compromise, just something to note, the issue of African Americans has always been an issue of politics, not justice. So the Democrats or the Republicans at one point or another will seem to champion African Americans, but really it's just for political means. During the Three-Fifths Compromise, you had both sides saying that African Americans should count as people, but only for political reasons. And so the compromise was found that 5 blacks would only count as 3 people for taxes, as the more of the conservative Republicans, the Federalists at that time in history, wanted, but also as representatives, as the Southern Democrats at the time wanted. So looking at the Federalists, go ahead and write this on the right-hand side of the notes. The left-hand side will be for the Democrats. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, they were typically supported by people that were bankers, manufacturers, commercial elite, much of what we see today, kind of that business mindset, if you will. They actually wanted to expand federal power Now that might sound kind of odd for a soon-to-be Republican to want federal power, more federal power in the economy, but it was for stability because they wanted to have a strong economy. Federal assumption of state debts was also an issue. After the American Revolution, the states had a lot of war debt, and so the federal government wanted to assume that so that they could offer a line of credit, so that they could be the ones in power of debt and foreign policy with other countries. They also wanted protective tariffs, again, to protect American-made manufacturing, much like Trump supporters today. They're Republican. They want to protect America first at the cost of global cooperation. They are also people who are loose in the interpretation of the Constitution, which again is ironic for future Republicans. But the Federalists, again, they wanted the federal government to have as much power as it could for the stability of the economy, the stability of the nation at the risk of the power of the states. So they wanted the Constitution to be loose so that the federal government could do as much as they needed for the strength of the nation. So a loose interpretation, that it wouldn't be strict, that they wouldn't be handcuffed, so to speak, but they would have a lot of loose powers. These Federalists were closet Great Britain supporters, England supporters, because they believed in the strength of England, and so they wanted to be tied to them. The case of Marbury versus Madison was the court case that gave more power to the federal government, the Supreme Court, on the ability to interpret the Constitution. And so that was an important court case that would discuss the Constitution and make the Supreme Court the interpreters of that Constitution. On the other hand, we have the Democratic Republicans, who are led by Thomas Jefferson and other anti-federalists that are afraid of the federal government power and want state rights. These are typically farmers, agrarian. They wanted to limit the federal power in favor of state rights. That's because they were more into personal freedoms. And so you have this fear of church and state uniting together. They want more freedom to the individual. They opposed federal assumption of state debts because they didn't want the federal government to have as much power. And they opposed protective tariffs. They wanted to, as farmers, they wanted to be able to have friendly relations with foreign nations, and they didn't care as much about that protective tariff on manufacturing. They wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution because, again, they wanted to protect the individual's rights. They believed that the federal government would have too much power. And I know this is ironic because the Democrats today are typically in favor of more federal power in the economy, but the Democratic Republicans of that time period were fearful of that. The election of 1800, you don't need to write this down, but this is where really the head-to-head contest really shows off. Adams versus Jefferson. The Democratic Republicans denounced Adams as strong centralization of federal power and new taxes, expansion of the U.S. Army and Navy, which is what Democrats attack Republicans today of, suspending of individual rights in the Alien and Sedition Acts. Again, this is something that Democrats decry against the Republicans, in that the Republicans are seen as not in favor of as much social rights and protests and such. And so the Democrats, even back then, would accuse the Republicans, or the Federalists at this point, of not being sensitive to the rights of the people. The Federalists, on the other hand, attacked Jefferson as being unchristian deist, as pro-French Revolution that would bring a lot of bloodshed. And so even back then, the soon-to-be Republicans, the Federalists at this point, would be attacking the Democrats with the same attacks that Republicans attack the Democrats as today, that they are too progressive and unchristian. The Democratic Republicans of the 1820s, go ahead and write this in the middle because James Monroe would be the president during one political party. The Federalist Party would die at the Hartford Convention. You don't need to write that down. But there was one political party. And so in the 1820s, the Democratic Republican Party would be the only party. And that's important because they will split soon and become the Democrats and then later the Republicans. This is known as the era of good feelings because there's only one political party. There's a lot of nationalism happening. There's a lot of harmony. Life is great unless you are, of course, African American and working on a plantation. The National Republicans, put this on the right, they were a footnote in history. John Quincy Adams. Again, they believed in federal government-funded public projects. This is part of what's known as the American system. Government-funded public projects, whether it's roads and canals and even public school, that taxes would be used for that. Now, taxation and public projects don't seem like a Republican idea, but at this point, it was all about growing the economy and business first, and so it was very much of a national Republican idea, the nation first, versus the freedom of the individual that the Democratic Party would champion. Then the Democrats, which would later lead to the modern Democrats of today in 1828. Andrew Jackson would be the first Democratic president. He believed in states' rights champion for the common man. He was the believer in the universal male suffrage, very progressive idea, because previous to this, the Federalists had supported the idea that it was just property owners that should vote. They didn't trust just any old male for voting. And so the Democrats believing in universal male suffrage was a very progressive idea. He also believed in destroying the U.S. Bank. Again, this is for the interest of the common man. He believed the U.S. Bank had too much power, that it was too pro-federalist and manufacturing and business and banking and everything. And so this is where the Democrats become really the champion of the common man, the union man, the working class man, the poor man. The Whigs, however, in 1832 would rise as a backlash to that. They opposed the presidential tyranny. So Andrew Jackson, his destroying of the U.S. Bank and many other things, such as the Trail of Tears, that he would force remove Cherokee and other Native American groups from Georgia. They attacked him as being too much of a tyrant because they believed that he was eroding Congress's authority. And so they become very much of the constitutional party, the party that promotes the Congress's authority versus the executive action and executive authority of the president. Now, the Whig Party would last just about as long as William Henry Harrison, not too much longer, who would die 30 days into his presidency and do very little. So that would bring the birth of the Republican Party that we have today. So finally, we have the Democrats of today and the Republicans of today. And the Republican Party was most famous for Abraham Lincoln, though he did not officially start the party. He would not become president until 1860. But the Republican Party's platform was to limit the spread of slavery. A lot of people think that they wanted to end slavery. And though that would have been a nice idea, again, for political reasons, it was really the extreme abolitionists that wanted to end slavery and do it now, people like John Brown. But the Abraham Lincoln and others, they were a lot more political. They just wanted to limit the spread of slavery. They didn't believe in rocking the boat of the Union. They believed that if they got rid of slavery, that a civil war would have broken out. And that's exactly what would happen, is a civil war would break out. And Abraham would have to face himself and realize how he was being politically lukewarm and have to actually make a stand. And so the Republican parties would be supported by Northern manufacturing, like the Federalists were, and the Republicans of today. 13th Amendment, however, would be a defining moment in Lincoln and the Republican Party's platform in that it argues from the Constitution that slavery must be abolished. And what is so important about this is that previous presidents had made executive orders on things that were very short-lived. And so to have something long-standing meant that the Constitution had to be changed, but changed in the right way. And so the Republicans do something very brilliant. They get the 13th Amendment passed, which ends slavery. Slavery was so terrible that it had to be abolished at the federal level. Not just allow the states to get rid of it in time. That would take too long. This is a moral sin, a moral issue, and Lincoln, halfway through the Civil War, becomes one of my most favorite presidents because he really looks at slavery as a constitutional issue that needs to be taken care of. And finally, he goes from being somewhat spineless to simply limiting the spread of slavery to actually outlawing slavery, and even later leading to, 5 years later, the total equality of African Americans. However, that would not be seen until another 100 years, unfortunately. The Democrats in 1932 would kind of rebrand themselves from simply the states' rights and anti-government idea. They would evolve from the Populist Party, the Progressive Party, that birthed a desire for more government involvement, more socialist ideas. The New Deal would really turn the Democrats into this social welfare and social engineering justice to fight the Great Depression and World War II. It was really FDR that rebranded the Democrats, that they would be the ones to really provide for the common man, this social welfare and social justice. Even though FDR would not push for full civil rights for African Americans, unfortunately, and he would also put Japanese in internment camps during World War II. Not very democratic ideals. However, his push for social welfare was a big move forward for his time. That would later lead to 1964 with LBJ. He would assume the presidency in 1963 after the death of JFK, but 1964 was his election. He believed in using troops over nukes. The Republicans believed that sending troops overseas was not a good idea, that we need to use nuclear bombs as a deterrent, as a threat against our enemies. Whereas the Democrats, they were afraid of the fallout of nuclear bombs, rightfully so, and so they desired to use and send more troops. And so LBJ would send 500,000 troops over to Vietnam, and would be a sad legacy for him and also for the Democratic Party. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, Voting Rights Act, would make the Democratic Party more of the minority party that supports minorities, again, for political reasons. They also wage a war on poverty and also create the Great Society, where LBJ takes what FDR had left behind with the New Deal, and he would expand that to a lot of more public social networks to help out the impoverished. And so the Democrats forever, since 1964, would become the party that champions the unemployed and the small working guy, whereas the Republicans would champion the business owner. The Republicans in 1980, led by Ronald Reagan, would capitalize on the silent majority that Richard Nixon had galvanized together. The silent majority was the group that had not protested the Vietnam War, was just working and middle-class America, and didn't care about politics. And so the Republicans under Richard Nixon and then under Ronald Reagan would really capitalize on that group. The moral majority under Jerry Falwell would make the Republican Party the official Christian party. And so they take religion and Christianity, evangelicalism, and brand the Republican Party as that party. Now, this was more of a political tactic versus a sincere move. While the Democrats are using the minority vote in an insincere way, the Republicans are using the Christian vote in an insincere way to gain more votes and more power. Reaganomics would be a capitalist economy under Ronald Reagan. Initially, this was very controversial, known as voodoo economics, but this business-first focused economy would prove to be very successful during his presidency as he grew the economy more than any other presidency at that time. It was the idea that tax breaks and giving money to the business owners would help the employees as it would trickle down to the employees versus just simply giving the employees tax benefits and free money and welfare that they had not worked for, which would be more of a democratic idea of working it. So go ahead and review through these notes. Again, this was just a general view. This was nothing in super detail, but we'll be looking throughout history class in more detail. This was just to give you a broad view. Thank you for taking these notes.